this Archaeological Institute of America sponsored lecture. This is the Rodney S. Young lecture, and I think we'll hear a bit more about this. The Archaeological Institute of America, or the AIA as we call it, supports many activities that have to do with scholarly research and also outreach in the community. The AIA has also been a diligent protector of cultural heritage and continues to be a leader in protecting antiquities worldwide. Dr. John Frey, our speaker today, is Associate Professor in the Department of Art History, and Design at Michigan State University. A classical archaeologist specializing in Greek and Roman architecture, Dr. Frey studied first and earned his BA in ancient history and the classics at Ohio State University, and then his MA and PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. Dr. Frey has extensive excavation experience in Greece and Egypt, and has focused on developing digital tools for the exploration and publication of archaeological archives. He has worked both at ancient Corinth and the nearby site of Isthmia. And in fact, he has just learned that he will be the new director of excavations at Isthmia. His recent his recent book, Spolia in Fortifications and the Role of the Common Builder in Late Antiquity, really embraces the ancient walls and the materials built into them, and asks the question that we've been puzzling over for a long time. Do these earlier materials have significant symbolism in their later secondary and even tertiary settings? Today, Dr. Frey will discuss digital archaeology and the dig in the 21st century. So please welcome our speaker.
Thank you so much, Professor Jushin. It's nice to quote unquote be your lecturer tonight. I wish I could say it's nice to be in Mississippi, but we'll have to settle for the virtual option here instead. Let me start with a couple of, hopefully you all can see. Eileen, are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Great. So hopefully you can see the sort of splash screen. But let me get started with a couple of things, just some sort of routine bookkeeping here. This is a live presentation. This is kind of interesting. The AIA is asking us to share this with you. It's a live presentation. Recording of this presentation is apparently by you is strictly prohibited because of intellectual property and the rest. But here's the interesting second slide. But we will be recording you. And so just be aware that perhaps questions you ask or things that are sort of asked and answered are part of the recorded record of this AIA talk. Speaking of which, this talk is brought to you as part of the Archaeological Institute of America National Lecture Program. So I'd like to share just a little bit with you about all the amazing things that the AIA does for archaeology in general and for archaeologists in America. It is North America's largest and oldest archaeological organization, having been founded in 1879. We boast over 200,000 members all around the world. The AIA lends lots of us support as archaeologists, as educators, as excavators, those of us who publish about the ancient world, those of us who are interested in site preservation and conservation. We always go to the AIA, and the AIA is always helpful to us in our needs. If you're interested in joining the AIA, if I'm not mistaken, along with AIA membership now, you get a subscription to Archaeology magazine. Over 700,000 people read this magazine issue by issue. It brings a wide variety of stories about all kinds of interesting things happening in the archaeological world. If you're more of the scholarly bent, you know that the AIA also supports the publication of the American Journal of Archaeology, which is sort of the A1 premier publication format for archaeological reports and studies of the ancient and classical world. But there are many, many other things the AIA does. The annual Fieldwork Opportunities Bulletin is also very helpful in putting archaeologists who want training or want field experience in touch with archaeologists who need people to work with them and for them. You can also, through the AIA, identify lectures, fairs, other types of events. You can also go on AIA tours. So be sure to check out archaeological.org and find the AIA tour option, which I assume is a little bit at this point hindered by our current pandemic circumstances, but certainly as soon as things get cleared, we'll be back to giving tours. You can become a part of this just by going to archaeological.org and signing up to become a member. It is not terribly expensive. It's especially affordable for students. You'll see that there are reduced rates for membership for students. And so you get a lot of benefits through this, not just the magazine, but the opportunity to participate in a lot of things that the AIA does. Keep in mind that if you're considering, if you're sitting on an enormous pile of cash and you have no idea what to do with it, consider giving some of it to support the Archaeological Institute of America, because that money then goes to support archaeological projects around the world: preservation, publication, conservation, archaeological research, excavation, survey, and all the rest. So consider that, consider giving a gift, consider supporting the AIA in ways more than just membership. Tonight, the AIA is actually sponsoring this lecture as the Rodney Young Memorial Lecture. Rodney Young was a graduate of Princeton University. He excavated in the Athenian Agora and elsewhere in Greece as a student. He eventually became curator of the Mediterranean section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and was professor of classical archaeology at UPenn in 1950. He began excavations in Gordion in Turkey. He directed those until his passing in 1974. He was president of the AIA from 1968 to 1972. He also served as the Norton Lecturer in the AIA. So he has a lot of close connections. He had a lot of close connections with the AIA. And so what used to be just a Philadelphia-centered sponsorship here was, through fundraising, turned into something that supports a national lecture. And so I'm very proud and honored to be this year's Young Memorial Lecturer. So hopefully everything is working okay for you. If you're not able to hear me or to see the screen or the slides, please send a chat or post a question right now. This is a webinar, and so only Professor Ajushi and I have control over the cameras and who can speak at the present moment. So if you do have questions or comments throughout, please leave us a chat or leave us a question, and if I can deal with it live, I will, but otherwise we'll save them for the end. Keep in mind too, that I have had far too many disastrous experiences of trying to debut or sort of demonstrate web utilities live. It almost always ends up with a lot of head scratching and swearing under your breath. And so what I've done tonight is I've provided you with a couple of screen captures of the digital tools that we've built for the excavations at Isthmia. And I'm more than happy to stick around as long as people want to stick around after the lecture to do a sort of less formal live demonstration of how the software works. So that having all been said, let's go ahead and get started. Just in case you're wondering, let me start with a little bit of introduction of what the excavations are. The excavations at Isthmia, the site of Isthmia, is actually located right here on the isthmus in Greece, very close to the place you may be more familiar with, the famous American excavations at Corinth. Isthmia was first directed by Oscar Bernier, who was a director of excavations at Corinth. Oscar Bernier sunk his first trenches at Isthmia in 1952 and excavated the remains of the temple there and the Temple Temenos, parts of the theater, and actually put a trench in the ground right over here in the 1950s to determine that this was in fact a Roman bath, and then sort of had done with it and moved on to other things. In 1967, he was succeeded in his directorship by Paul Clement with the University of California, Los Angeles. Paul Clement directed excavations dealing mainly with the late Roman and Byzantine remains. Oscar Bernier was succeeded in his work by Elizabeth Gebhard. Betsy Gebhard with the University of Chicago continues to collaborate with the University of Chicago as director of the Chicago excavations at Isthmia. In 1986, Paul Clement was succeeded by Timothy Gregory, and the excavations passed over to Ohio State University. And so it's largely what I'm going to report on today is the work that I have done as part of the OSU excavations at Isthmia. Just about a month ago, it finally became approved by the American School of Classical Studies at Athens. And so from probably this point forward, the excavations will be known as the Michigan State University excavations at Isthmia. So keep your eyes open for that as I sort of attempt to continue the long and important legacy of work at the site at Isthmia. So let me move forward and tell you that Isthmia, in addition to being located very, very close to Corinth and sponsored in large part by Corinth, Isthmia is the site of one of the 4 great Pan-Hellenic crown games in antiquity. You may be more familiar with the site of Delphi. You are certainly more familiar with the Olympic Games, but those 2 sites shared a cycle, a 4-year cycle with Isthmia and with Nemea as the crown games to which all Greek-speaking athletes would be invited to compete. They were called the crown games because in the games, what you won was simply a crown of olive or celery or pine or laurel as the different sanctuaries would give according to their own character. Isthmia is famous archaeologically for a couple of things. One thing that I'll point out to you is located right here. In a place known as, that we refer to it as the earlier stadium. Oscar Bernier in the 1950s excavated something that very much confused him until with additional study and textual references, he was able to determine that this was actually an early stadium starting line. That in the athletic games at Isthmia, which began as early as 582 BC, there apparently was a problem, as there were at many athletic sites, about ensuring fairness in the start of the foot races. And so what we actually are looking at here are the remains of a very early effort to create a sort of shared starting line among athletes to keep cheating to a minimum. There's a certain amount of evidence that suggests that this starting line and the stadium as a whole were abandoned pretty early on in the history of Isthmia. So apparently the effort to keep cheating at bay was not as successful as the officiants would have hoped. The site is also famous as the location perhaps of one of the earliest Doric-style temples in the Peloponnesus, in all of southern Greece. So we're looking here at a plan of the remains of the archaic temple of Poseidon at Isthmia. The sanctuary is dedicated to Poseidon. And here is a reconstruction of what they think the temple would have looked like, with painted panels on walls that were built on top of a stone socle, and perhaps some of the earliest explorations of stone architecture in the ancient world for the Doric tradition. What you're looking at over here on the right was located right here off the front porch of the temple. This is a very, very early and very important perirenterion. So essentially a watered basin that was used for ablutions or for cleaning yourself or for sort of preparing yourself for the rituals that occurred in front of the temple. The last thing I'll point to that the sanctuary is famous for is its Roman bath. Excavated largely in the 1960s and 1970s, this bath produced in what we term Room 6 one of the largest examples of a monochrome Roman period mosaic in the Eastern Mediterranean. You may be familiar with other mosaics of this type from the site of Ostia, but Isthmia has an exceptionally large example here. Now, an interesting thing about this mosaic is that it was actually found in a very demolished state, that the large vaulted ceiling that had once covered this room in late antiquity had collapsed. And the collapse had actually caused significant damage to the figural mosaic. And so in the 1980s, archaeologists under the directorship of Timothy Gregory at Ohio State University actually lifted the whole entire mosaic piece by piece in a rather complicated process that probably would take too long to describe, and excavated underneath it, and then refilled the excavation of this sealed deposit and relaid the whole entire mosaic so it can be seen in its restored state today. Perhaps another discussion for another day has to do with the lines that you see right here. And they move over here and back again, because what archaeologists found when they dug beneath the floor of the Roman bath was a large Greek pool that probably measured something close to 100 feet on a side, 100 Greek feet on a side, and probably held something close to 1 million liters of water. So we're talking about an enormous pool, a very suitable and appropriate thing to have at a sanctuary of Poseidon. There you see Timothy Gregory standing on top of the restored mosaic, giving a tour of the site. So just wanted to put him in here to show you the size of the mosaic we're talking about, and also to sort of give a hats off to Tim. So let's talk about what goes on these days at Isthmia. We're not doing much excavation these days. Instead, we're trying to work through the enormous backlog of material that has been accumulated since the 1960s at the site. We're working on a number of publications that resulted from those early excavations. And so a lot of our work these days centers on what we would refer to as archival archaeology. In other talks, I would tell you that, yes, I would like to argue that you can actually dig the same hole twice. What we're trying to do is work through all of the forms of documentation that the archaeologists left us from their excavations in the 1960s and 1970s, and we're attempting to virtually put back together their excavations and then to share the published results that we determined from those virtual excavations. We're trying to share those publications with the academic community and the interested public in general. So one of the most important parts of that excavation has to do with these tiny little gray bound volumes you see here. If you're familiar with fieldwork at all, you know that archaeologists typically, if they don't have a whip in one hand and a felt fedora in the other, they will typically be seen as having a trowel in one hand and a field diary, a notebook in the other. And these are the notebooks that have to do with the excavations at Isthmia since Paul Clement took over in 1967. Just to give you a brief overview of what these things look like, they were largely up to the individual archaeologists to determine what needed to be recorded and in what format. And so these are incredibly diverse documentations of excavation. What an archaeologist is supposed to do in these books is write down the soil conditions, write down their ongoing interpretation of the archaeological remains, document any significant finds, and when these excavations are over for that season, attempt to document the different strata of soil and with photographs, the major discoveries. And so what you see here is just an assortment of what you find in these individual notebooks. Now, the thing that I want to talk to you about tonight, about sort of being a 21st century dig, a 20th century dig attempting to be a 21st century dig, has a lot to do with these notebooks. Because as I was starting to become sort of a field archaeologist at Isthmia and an archival archaeologist at Isthmia, I was discovering that there were many times that I would spend all summer looking at the archaeological remains and looking at the notebooks, and then returning home to Michigan in the fall, only to discover that a critical bit of information I had failed to copy down, I had failed to record in one of the notebooks. And that was a very significant impediment to my research, because then you had to wait until you could buy the plane ticket and fly all the way back to consult these documents again. So very, very early on in the 2000s, I actually encouraged a number of students to assist me in digitizing and scanning all of the notebooks. Once I had all of the notebooks on a hard drive, it wasn't too big of a leap of the imagination to say, well, why should I keep all these for myself? I should share these. I should share them digitally. And so with the help of the National Endowment of the Humanities, for the humanities, 2 different grants help fund the tool that I'm going to show you now. In developing this project, this digital project, we had a couple of sort of initial goals. The one was that in the late 1990s and early 2000s, we saw a significant change in the way that field methods were being practiced in several parts of the Mediterranean world. People were going digital. In some people's expressions, it's going paperless. It's sort of a more colloquial expression, iPads in the trenches, which is what you see here. Some archaeologists were deciding that digital workflows were the way of the future, and they were a far better way to record information. If you took, with the right software, if you took an iPad into the field, you could shoot photographs, record notes, record audio files. You could compare things. If you were connected to the internet, you could compare things to other places. So for example, even at the trowel's edge, if you pulled something out of the ground and you weren't entirely sure what it was, you could quickly consult your iPad and determine an interpretation on the fly at the moment. Many digs that we refer to now as born digital digs had their start in this digital practice, that they actually never ever were paper. that essentially from the moment they opened Excavations in the early 2000s and they continue today, it's all about databases and integrated digital workflows and digital tools to speed, streamline, and systematize the process of excavation and recording. This raised immediate questions for me and for other archaeologists that took part in much older digs. What do we do when the new digs that are born digital have basically started to go off in their direction with digital workflows and digital ideas and digital products? What are the folks with 50, 60, in the case of Corinth, well over 100 years worth of paper-based records? What were we supposed to do in order to keep up with the digital revolution? I often make the comparison that in many ways it was like the digital boat was leaving the dock, and archaeologists who were still in the analog tradition were required to figure out, are you going to jump in the boat and leave the dock behind, or are you going to stay on the dock and wave goodbye to the boat, because you can't keep one foot in each. And so in some ways, we started to look toward building a digital tool that would actually allow people to kind of keep one foot in each of those two worlds. Most of the people that we consulted in our initial effort to develop a digital tool to bring the analog tradition into the digital world would quickly tell us, oh, you just need to start over. You just need to build a database and you just start from today and then you do your digital dig from here on out. And the problem that we had with this was that in many ways, digital archaeologists we found were attempting to reinvent the wheel, that they basically had decided to dismiss and walk away from the old traditional ways of keeping records at digs. But the problem with this was that those old traditional digs actually had developed over decades and decades of trial and error, had actually developed a system that worked very, very well. That what we came to discover as we began to digitize the archive at Isthmia was that archaeologists had essentially created already a digital, an analog version of a database. That when you open up one of these notebooks, as you see here, when you open up this notebook, what you find are references to photographs. So you could go out and look at photographs, references to reports that they wrote, and you could then branch out to that. You see all of these different links could be forged between the central notebook and the inventoried objects and maps and plans and databases. And what we tried to do was not reinvent the wheel. We tried to capture in digital form the already genius and brilliant way of keeping records that had been developed by archaeologists since the late 1800s. This also created problems for us because in attempting to digitize the contents of a notebook, we ran into problems with transcriptions. And in this slide, what I'm trying to show you is our best effort very early on in the 2000s, our best effort to turn an analog handwritten notebook into a digital document. And what we found is that we could actually transcribe all of the words, but what we lost was the kind of organic integrated nature of the document itself. Notebooks are incredibly diverse documents. They have photographs, they have drawings, and they are living documents. They will have things where people come in later in a different handwriting, a different font, a different pen or pencil, and write in notes, comments, corrections, observations. These are actually documents that live and grow from year to year. So maybe you'll find a moment where somebody comes in and says, no, this can't possibly be right. This coin has to date to this year. And they will leave those notes in that document. And what we found was that the digital transcription did not do a very good job of capturing that. Now, granted, technology has moved forward and the text encoding initiative and different forms of transcription actually are able to encode, this is in a different font, this is in a different pen, this is in a different color. You can actually encode that into a document and make it machine readable. But we were concerned about the fact that we were losing some of this kind of like original, organic, integrated beauty of the handwritten document. The thing we also had a problem with was that once you digitize all of that information, it starts to look like this. And what you started to lose was what we termed sort of the serendipity, the accidental discovery of being in an archive. That when you access digital information through an online portal or through a database, you lose a lot of the things that you get when you go to visit an actual traditional archaeological archive. If you had a problem or a question with the data, there wasn't the assistant director standing there and able to tell you, oh, well, that's because, or, oh, that's not what you want to look at. You want to look at this. You lose the ability to simply leaf through a volume of something to see, for example, if you had a lamp and you weren't entirely sure of the date. With a database like this, you have to know the date in order to call up a comparative example. At an archaeological archive, you can simply flip through photographs of other documents. You can simply look through other volumes of books. You can find your comparanda in slightly less sort of specific word search kind of ways. The last thing that really kind of concerned us was that we're not all the Athenian Agora. We don't all have the extensive resources and staff in order to completely digitize our archives at the same time, or to have archivists help us with our work. Just a quick comparison. This is just a quick shot of what archives look at a well-funded excavation. This is what I have to deal with, or I get to deal with at excavations at Isthmia. That basically I'm relying a lot on student volunteers and people who have come to learn fieldwork. I'm relying a lot on people who, in this case, you see right here, who are far more interested, as you can tell, in their juice box, and I think at the time playing Candy Crush, than they were in actually digitizing the contents of the excavation. And so, you know, your limited funds, limited resources, limited personnel. And so, you know, we recognize that not all digs are super well funded and are able to do this just because they say it's time to do it. You have to do it on a shoestring budget. So at the end of the day, this is what we built. We built the Archaeological Resource Cataloging System. And what you're looking at here is a screenshot I took just this morning of how ARCS works. What it essentially does is it presents to you what we tried to do was, instead of reinvent the archive, we tried to essentially move the archive in all of its best aspects into the digital world. So you're not going to find a transcription. You are going to find the original document here presented for you. You can leaf through it still as you would in a traditional archive where you leaf through the physical book. You're going to be able to sort of note that this thing is a reference to a certain type of roof tile, and you're going to be able, let me show you here. Actually, I'll show you in a future slide. You're going to be able to actually form annotations and link out to other things. So where on your desk, you may actually have a pile of different notebooks and photographs and reports and artifacts, you can kind of virtually do that here in the ARCS system. What kind of problems did we solve? Well, as you can see here from this beautiful copy stand, I don't know if you can notice this, but it's a camera attached to a chair. And I think he decided to use a sculptured bust as the counterweight so the camera didn't fall over. So this is our copy stand for digitizing inventory cards. So if you're a dig that runs like this on a shoestring budget, ARCS is free, it's open source. You can download the software off of GitHub with a small amount of infrastructure. You have to find your own server space. You can build a version of ARCS for your own archaeological project. Because we understood that you didn't have a lot of personnel to work with and a lot of funds to pay actual professional archivists, we tried to work with a crowdsourcing option. Basically, what that means is that volunteers and interested individuals who want to make your system better can do so by gaining a username and password and then being given certain amounts of access to certain documents that they can make the changes to. They can improve your archive for you. What we also noticed was that we were able now to build something that is essentially, it goes in the digital world, it goes by the expression VRE. We've built a virtual research environment. And what that means is that archaeologists don't necessarily all have to come together at Isthmia anymore. That you can build collections of archival documents through the online portal, and all of those things can be grouped into one collection. That collection is given a web address. You can invite your friends to share that web address, and you can all collaborate asynchronously from any part in the world. We've built lots of tools where people can have discussions, asynchronous discussions with each other. There's ways that you can share corrections and comments. You can add to collections. You can take things away. All of those things are now possible. What we also discovered was, with the system we built, we can now bring students to the archive at Isthmia without them having to afford the expensive plane ticket and the study abroad program fees and different things like that. We've essentially built a teaching tool that allows you to bring the archive into the classroom or into the public and show how the raw documents of archaeological investigation actually become the publications or the lectures that we give in public. One of the things that I've discovered as a field archaeologist, training other archaeologists, one of the best ways to learn how to dig and how to keep proper records is to make somebody read a bad notebook where the documents have been kept not as accurately as you'd like. And as you read a document, as you read a notebook, you become frustrated with, why didn't this person record more elevations? Why didn't this person record more what the soil looked like? And you learn from their mistakes how to become a better recorder of your observations in the field. So a couple of things. We went through 2 different NEH grants. The first NEH grant produced a certain version of it. Then with another NEH grant, we were able to improve it dramatically. So now we actually have the thing based upon a thing referred to as the Cora Digital Repository. Cora is a thing that was built by a research institute here at MSU called Matrix, and it is a digital asset management system. It's essentially you throw digital things into it, it gives all of the digital things their own unique identifier, and it helps connect metadata to those individual instantiations of objects. We had to build a much, much better metadata structure. We'll talk about that in a second. But we did all these kind of things where you could basically import and export different things into and out of the system as you needed for your research or as you were able to produce at your project. So for example, if you're only able to scan 20 notebooks with your volunteers one summer, but you have 300 notebooks to do, that's okay. You can just scan your 20 notebooks, upload them, and next season you can add more. It doesn't all have to be done in one big go. So this is the Cora Digital Repository and Publishing Platform. It's at projects.cora.matrix.msu.edu. I don't think I've got enough dots in there yet, but that's where you can find it. I will provide you with a URL if you're interested in talking to the folks at Matrix about organizing your data using Cora. Essentially, Cora is a digital cabinet. You put all of your stuff in it and it keeps it all filed correctly so that when you build arcs on top of Cora, it would keep everything sorted and keep everything effectively identifiable. This is what I was hoping to show you before. We've built a very, very smart user interface, I think, where you can scan through the individual pages of a notebook. You can zoom in, you can rotate, but the other interesting thing I'm showing you here is you can do a thing called annotation. Because notebooks often are the core element of a multi-relational analog database. We've built this thing so that you can, in the same way that you identify your friends on Facebook, essentially, you can mouse over things and mark them as significant. And that calls up this window and you tell it what in the system you want it to refer to, and it will now forge a link between those 2 objects. So this is the crowdsourcing thing. It takes a lot of time and effort to get through doing something like this. But essentially what we can do now as learning activities or as things for public outreach, we can ask people to have a sort of annotation-a-thon where everybody sort of goes in and throws all their effort toward one notebook, creating all of these connections between the diverse data types so that people can now just go between the data types with one quick click. And so you see here what happens when you follow this link. It takes you to this document where more information is provided. And what you should be able to do then is forge a link here that takes you back to the notebook. The idea here is that we're trying to build a system that no matter which way you enter into it, do you want to look at pictures? Fine. Do you want to read reports? Fine. Do you want to look at notebooks? Fine. Regardless of the way you get into the system should branch out to all the other forms of information that are available in the digital archive. In order to do this, we've had to create an extremely robust metadata scheme. I'm sorry, let me get to the crowdsourcing thing first. So in order to do this, we're going to need a lot of manpower. And more manpower, I think, than most archaeological projects can afford. So we've turned to a crowdsourcing option. And what we do is we actually have a way that different people have different levels of administrative access. So me as the super admin can invite people, can give them access to different collections and things like that. I can also make certain things public and private. So for example, if we have scholars that are actually working on publications and they don't want the raw information to be shared in with the public until their publication comes out, we can designate certain parts of the collection as private. And only people like the researcher with special access can see those digital artifacts. For crowdsourcers, perhaps you don't want to give a sophomore archaeology student complete access to the whole entire system with the ability to delete and add things. So you designate a certain lower level access for them. They can make metadata changes. They can add connections between document types, but that's all they can do. We've also built into the system a way for senior administrators to authenticate and verify edits and changes that are made to the system. So all of these are sort of ways to make sure that crowdsourcing doesn't run amok and ruin all of the stuff that you've put into your system. So here are some of the challenges and the insights that we've gained through what is now, I think, coming up on like an 8-year-long project. We've understood when people say, well, what does ARCS do? It becomes a lot easier to talk about what ARCS doesn't do. In some ways, we are not an archive. We simply do not have the ability to control the way that all of these different digs are going to upload their documents. And so therefore, we cannot guarantee archival quality of data. What we recommend is that people have an archival collection and save it to their hard drives or save it to places like Open Context or other online repositories, and then have a sort of low resolution copy of that uploaded to ARCS to be able to play with. That way, the data is never corrupted, the data is secure, and it sits separate from the rest. What else have we discovered? We're not an archival solution. We are not a research solution either. And the way we try to explain this is we use the analogy of a library. You go into a library, well, you used to, and back, before March, you would go into a library in order to do research. And it is the job of the librarian to assist you in finding the books and articles you need. It is not the job of the librarian to sit there and read the books for you and tell you which pages contain the information that you want. So we've tried to adopt that philosophy with ARCS. ARCS can deliver you the information, can deliver you the books and the reports and the photographs, but extracting meaningful information out of that is still up to you. And we are not, the other interesting thing that we've learned is that we are not a system that is going to guarantee that every project is going to do everything the same way. For those of you who are familiar with fieldwork at different archaeological projects, you will understand that each excavation, each survey, and this isn't just a thing between North America and, or sort of the Americas and the classical world. This is a thing even between archaeology in Italy and archaeology in Greece and archaeology on Crete. Every individual dig has its own way of identifying objects, of recording data, and those ways are fiercely defended by those digs. And so we recognized very early on that what we couldn't do with this system was walk into a dig and tell them, okay, from now on, you have to call this amphora by this name, and you have to call this lamp by this name, and you have to say that this coin dates to this date according to this system of chronology. We realized that as soon as we ever tried to say that, everyone would turn around and walk away. So we said, how are we going to get different people to talk to each other and to use this system? And what we discovered was that regardless of how you classify artifacts, you essentially use the same, or at least traditional digs before the digital revolution, use the same methods of recording that information. That all digs tend to use handwritten notebooks. All digs tend to use black and white photographs. All digs tend to use typewritten end of season reports. And if we focused on that, that was the one thread of commonality among these different projects that we could latch onto. So what we did is we built a thing called ARCS Core. And we built that on top of a thing that was developed at Virginia by Lucy Stelianopoulos. She called her thing Archaeocore, which was an attempt to systematize the way that she was dealing with her archives. We built on top of that and built a thing called ARCS Core. And what we think of it as is bundles of resources. So inside the big brownish, grayish, I'm not sure what color that is, circle, is all of the metadata that has to do with the archaeological project itself. Where in the world are you? How long have you been at work? Who's been the director? That kind of thing. Then within that, we have individual campaigns. Was this summer of 1968? Was it winter of 1985? Which discrete period of time were you doing archaeological investigation? And then within that, we sorted all of the individual types of documents. Did you keep records in a notebook? Did you keep records on on black and white film? Did you record your stuff on a sheet of paper? And each of those things gets its own metadata as well. So what we ended up with was a multi-tiered metadata scheme that goes all the way from the level of the project down to the level of the archival object itself, and then for projects that are interested and willing, down to the level of the object that the archival document describes. If you want to go play, you can download the ARC's core metadata scheme. If I'm not mistaken, our project was the first to ever publish a metadata scheme in archaeology on GitHub. Not sure if that's a claim to fame, but there you go, all the same. Here was another interesting challenge and an insight. We started to recognize that the open access policies that we were attempting to pursue, the open access way that we wanted to do this, we wanted to take everything inside of our archive, turn it into digital data, and let anyone who wants to play on the internet have a look at it. This was a very, very disruptive thing. And we discovered the ways in which it was disruptive. So for example, you could, as a traditional archaeological dig, claim to be open to anyone who wanted to come. But there were always these impediments to being able to do that. You had to get airfare, you had to find a hotel, you had to get permission of the director, you had to show up at the right time of year, you had to pay for your whole entire trip. There were all of these massive impediments to access to archaeological data. In making all of our data open access, we threw open the doors to anyone who wanted to come play. And this has not always been received terribly well across the full breadth of the archaeological community. The other interesting thing we found was that going digital opens up very new avenues of critical introspection. One of the things I learned was that the old way of doing things, the old sort of traditional field school thing, was that a professor at a university would have a field school and students would get, usually graduate students, would get the opportunity to come work with them on their project. And they would keep all of the documents and record all of the things. And then they would go home. And perhaps if they continued to have a relationship with that dig, they would be given the right to publish some of the things that they had excavated. More and more these days, as we move into the digital realm, with ideas of intellectual property and digital intellectual rights, we came to discover that actually digitizing these notebooks and putting them up online was a way of sort of reinvestigating those relationships of editorial rights and publication rights and things like that. We had to treat each individual notebook as its own intellectual property entity. And so I'm still engaged in the process of trying to track down these graduate students and ask them, hey, you kept the notebook in 1978 at Isthmia. Is it okay with you if we turn it into digital data and publish it for all the world to see? Because we're trying our hardest to respect the intellectual property of those graduate students. And while I was doing that, the other shoe dropped and I realized I needed to respect the intellectual property of my own student volunteers who were working for me as part of a study abroad and as part of a field school. So I've tried very hard to recognize Emily and Lucy here for the hard work that they did in helping me build the ARC's collection. So you'll see actually in ARC's that there is a whole sort of credits for what everybody did, an attempt to recognize as much as possible their intellectual property. All of the students that work on this project for us now are asked to sign memorandums of understanding where they agree to share the intellectual property of their digital work with the wider community. Let me close with one example of how this is. So it's sort of like, hey, this is all well and good, but does the system actually work? Well, let me show you one way in which it worked very, very early on before the thing was even done. So over here, you see Teresa. In 2010, we had the fortunate opportunity to be asked by the FORIA to clean up an excavated trench, a trench that had been excavated in the 1970s that was beginning to cave in, was getting dangerous for tourists. So the FORIA asked us to clean it out and then to investigate it and then to make it safer so that people didn't fall in the hole. And as part of doing that, you see Teresa here found this interesting terracotta artifact. And one of the neat parts about it is that by this point, we had digitized all of the inventoried artifact cards for the excavations around this area where she had found this. And so we were able to actually look through all of the inventory cards very, very quickly using the ARCS system. And this is where I think it's very, very important. You see, we did a composite drawing. There are actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different discretely discovered artifacts here that come together to make this composite rendering of what turns out to be a terracotta cyma, most likely dating to the 2nd century AD. But here's the interesting thing. Over here, I'm not sure if you can see it on this slide, but over here, this is actually simply described as architectural terracotta with relief. Now, if we had just been working with a digital database and we knew that this thing was a terracotta cyma, if we had searched for cyma, this thing would never have turned up. Instead, what we did was we said, show us all the artifacts that were cataloged from 1978 on. And this turned up serendipitously by basically, essentially, digitally thumbing through all of the inventory cards until we found things that shared the design of the artifact that we had found. The interesting thing about that then was it allowed us to create a collection of artifacts, which we then extracted data from, which allowed us to plot the locations of other terracotta cymas. And as it turns out, at Isthmia, we seem to have terracotta cymas of the same design found here, up over here, here by the bath. This is Teresa's 2010 trench right here, and throughout the Roman theater. And what we found then suggests that actually in the Roman period, architects and builders attempted to systematize a number of different monuments at Isthmia and create an enormous enclosed colonnaded courtyard in the lower sanctuary at Isthmia. And the closest parallel we have to that probably shouldn't have surprised us. The closest parallel we have to that is the gymnasium and palaestra complex at Olympia, where different stoas with colonnades are built around a large courtyard associated with a palaestra, associated with a bathing structure. So you can see the similarities that we have here, and that shouldn't surprise us. Isthmia and Olympia both being part of the Panhellenic Crown Games in the Greek and in the Roman period. So I'll go ahead and stop now because I'm coming up on 50 minutes, I think, and I promised 45. If you're interested in learning more about the ARCS system, here are the web addresses that you need to know. Just to learn about ARCS, you can go here. To see what's available for the Isthmia project, go here and select projects. To access our metadata schema, you can go to GitHub right there. To install a version of ARCS yourself, you should probably contact us first so we can give you instructions on how to do it, but all the files are freely available on GitHub. And if you're interested in participating at all in playing this sort of fun game we're playing with digital archival archaeology, send me an email and I will be happy to have a fun conversation with you. So that's about it. I'm going to go ahead and stop screen sharing, I think, and turn it over to anyone who has questions or comments. You can do that either in the chat or you can post a question in the Q&A and Professor Ajushin and I can respond. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frey. Who has questions to our speaker? Well, I have a question. What you did with the terracotta cyma is very exciting because that's what we do often at Corinth, except it's not all digitized. I mean, some of it actually is digitized, but not as completely as your site. So it really does work, though, that you can find things from disparate corners of the site that actually go together. And I was curious about the levels in which these terracotta fragments were found.
Right. So the interesting thing about that is that the ARC system was so young at the time. We actually had students up on the laptops in the sort of graphio of the dig house that were sort of looking for things on the inventory cards at the same time as we had students actually pulling out boxes and bins and looking for terracotta pieces that might match. And it was funny because the student would come running out of the office and would say, "We found one," at the same time as a student would pull one out of the, and these would often match. We're like, "We found one." It's like, "We did too. Oh my gosh, it's the same one." So we were finding actually that the digital search was almost as fast and as effective as the manual search, which is kind of interesting. We're getting, so where we're getting most of the terracotta antefixes, I'm sorry, terracotta saimas, we're in Betsy's excavation of the theater courtyard, and in the collapsed debris of the Roman bath. And both of those seem to be 2nd century AD contexts. You know, the 2nd century AD Saima in a sort of 4th, 5th century destruction context. Our closest comparison, you would certainly know this, our closest comparison is currently Nancy and Ron's excavation of the Demeter and Kore sanctuary. She has a lion's, I think they have a lion's head water spout made out of terracotta that's almost a dead-on match to one of the ones we found.
I see some questions on chat from Annabelle Harris. Are you going to continue using notebooks in the field and then digitizing those, or digitally record new excavations through the use of field forms?
Yeah, that's a question. That is a really important question. I don't have an answer for it yet. I pretended that this thing was going to allow us to keep 1 foot on the dock and 1 foot in the boat, but it's not working. Currently what we're doing, because we're actually still going back through the notebooks and we're still doing it the old way, where as we're working through a backlog of material and processing it, if we find, I don't know if I'm able to show you this, it might be difficult, but what we do at Isthmia is what happens at a lot of projects. Here, for example, if you find an artifact and you inventory the artifact, what you're supposed to do is go back into the notebook and in red, mark at the closest possible place to the moment of discovery, you're supposed to mark in red the inventory number of that artifact. And we're still finding artifacts that we want to inventory. So we're still literally going back into notebooks from the 1960s and in red ink writing numbers on them. And so this creates a real problem for the digital archive, because now imagine this 2-page spread right here, someone finds another artifact and has to write something in. Now the digital is falling out of sync with the analog. And so oddly enough, now next to all of the notebooks, we keep a log book that says, you know, record here all changes that you made to the paper archive this year. And then at the end of the season, it's my job to go back through and scan all of those notebooks again so that they could be reintegrated into ARC, so that the digital maintains its synchronicity with the analog. It's a real headache. And it seems like what we really should do is move over to an all digital workflow. But we're not really sure if we're ready to do that yet. Fortunately for us, we're not doing a lot of field work, so we're not keeping new notebooks. So we can kind of kick that conversation down the road a little bit and put off having to make the final jump to the digital.
There's another question, comment from Dr. Jackie DiBiase Salmons, our colleague in the Department of Classics. Thank you so much for this talk. Can you tell us about your plans for the future of ARCs? Are there features you hope to add?
So this is interesting. So as part of the original NEH grant, we had actually contacted the excavations at Polis on Cyprus. Okay, the old excavations there. We contacted with the excavations at Tariq Chersonesus on the Black Sea coast, and we collaborated with the excavations with Kim at Nemea. And the idea here is that we wanted a relatively wide spread of different archaeological projects, because we were very aware of the danger of basically making a custom built, open, it may be open access and open source, but we ran the danger of creating something that only worked for Isthmia. And so now we're in the process of trying to build up ARCs or whatever, like ARCs installs for these other projects, to see the ways in which we were too short-sighted in just building for the idiosyncrasies of Isthmia. So that's where we're at right now. But at this point, it's kind of thrown open. The code is essentially done. If people want to build on their own, and see if we can collaborate around that, that would be absolutely great. I see that there's a comment in a question in the Q&A about Greek excavations or projects worldwide. We built into the system the ability to transcribe and translate. And so at least as far as the archaeological resources are concerned, if you have a notebook written in French or German or Greek or Arabic or something like that, you should be able to still interact with the site perfectly fine. But you would also then over here under details, you have the ability to transcribe into any other language, but that's going to have to be done manually. Certainly multiple language support through the website itself is not exactly a thing that we can do just yet. We're going to need another grant to actually make all of this, right? To make all of the words, the metadata scheme, all that, to translate that into another language. And it would be ideal because right now it is a very Anglophone kind of centered project.
I see there's a question about the grant process for ARCs.
It's changed a little bit. The way this was done was it was a slow buildup. In 2008, I decided that I wanted to start building something, and I used a very, very small grant from my own College of Arts and Letters here at Michigan State. They funded me a little bit of student programmer time and student design time. And I had sort of meetings with them over the course of a year, and they kind of built something that roughed out how the idea would look. I then took that and applied to an NEH Digital Humanities Startup Grant Program, which funded another year's worth of work to build it a bit more. I think that program has been suspended. I think they do it as a multi-stage project now. But look at the NEH Digital Humanities unit, and you'll see that there's lots of funding still available for sort of forward-thinking digital projects that might have applicability outside of an instance of a very specific instance. Then on the basis of what we had produced in the Digital Humanities Startup Grant, we applied for a Digital Humanities Implementation Grant, which was a 3-year grant. We were unsuccessful the first time, but then made some adjustments and reapplied the next year and were successful and received a 3-year grant. After that, we applied for a 1-year no-cost extension, which essentially means the NEH isn't on the hook for any more money, but they'll let you keep working on the project and you don't owe them the final product until then. And so under that, we managed to finish up. And so now we're getting ready to sort of, we're in the place where we're excited about opportunities like this to be able to share it with interested people, both interested people who want to participate in the crowdsourcing, you know, the sort of the playing with the artifacts and the playing with the digital artifacts, but also people who want to implement it at their own archaeological projects. So yeah, so if you're interested in joining the kind of crowdsourcing effort, it would be great. Please send me an email. I'd be happy to sign you up and we can do a sort of training session and then you're off and running.
Thank you so much, Dr. Frey. Are there other questions, comments?
Thank you all very, very much for your time. If there aren't any other questions or comments, I was telling Professor Jushin that if students, she told me there were students interested in digital archaeology. If you all want to stick around, I'll stop screen sharing, and at least for the moment, and I can give everybody who sticks around just talkie rights, and we can have a conversation about ARCs or about digital archaeology. You're not obligated, but certainly I'm at your disposal if you want to stick around and talk.
I see from our chair, Dr. Molly Pasca-Prenger, she asks, can you imagine a way of constructing an internship around this?
We do.
Project?
I do build actual student internships around this. One of the ways that we're doing it is a slightly different project, but it relies very closely on the ARC system. What we're doing is it's an oddity of Isthmia. There was never from the beginning an organized plan of the site. Each individual area of excavation, sometimes separated by several hundred meters from each other, each individual area of excavation was treated as its own unit with its own sort of internal coordinate system. And so now we're actually building up a complete scalable model of the site. And one of the things about that's interesting is that we're going back into the notebooks digitally, you know, especially now, right? When the pandemic kept us from going to Greece this summer, I still kept a number of student interns, and we investigated the notebooks virtually and looked through and extracted spatial information out of the notebook for all of the inventoried artifacts. And so now we're actually creating a site-wide plan of all inventoried objects. And hopefully by the end of the year, maybe a little bit into next year, we'll be able to actually query, show me where all of the coins, you know, of Valentinian are across the site. Show me where all of the stamped roof tiles are, and be able to have a sort of accurate GIS sort of map of where all the artifacts are. And that's directly dependent on our ability to access that data, you know, through ARCs, because we can't go to Greece. There's also a question here about how do you feel about the transition from hard copies to technology? I'm really torn about this. I'm probably the archaeological version of the guy who still listens to vinyl LPs. I love these notebooks. I love them in a way that's probably not healthy. I like the fact that you can still crack one open and find little bits of leaves pressed in between the pages. You can find splotches of blood and sweat. You can find little notes written by somebody. There's math on the back where somebody's trying to figure out how many drachmas they owe their, you know, the other excavator in the other trench. And they're just, they really are just beautiful, beautiful artifacts in their own right. And so I have a really hard time transitioning out of those. It's hard to imagine that you'd have that sort of tactile beauty of these artifacts, even in the thing I built, much less going totally digital. And so in some ways, I'm really kind of torn about this. I know it's easier to store. I know it provides better access. I know it's a smarter, more streamlined way of working, but God, I love these notebooks a lot. There's just a beauty to them. Actually, if I could go on just for a quick second about that, one of the odd things about it is that I have come to know a number of archaeologists through their notebooks, not ever having met them before. And there is a way in which I have become this really weird kind of like cult fan of certain individuals. And like just a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to be out in Los Angeles, and I looked up this guy. He's not even an archaeologist. He ended up getting into real estate. But I think he was a bit confused about why, like, there was this sort of like this aura of hero worship about me having lunch with him. I just kept saying, "Oh my God, it's really you!" I come to sort of idolize this guy through his notebooks, and he's like, "Yeah, that's nice, but you know." So. By the way, is Professor Pasco Prenger still in here? Are you still in the? I don't know. I just wanted to say I absolutely enjoyed your article on female nudity in public performance. I taught it last semester. We had a wonderful class all around women in baths, and it was just it was a brilliant article. So thank you for that. So if there aren't any other questions, I think what I can do here is that under the participants, maybe, if I'm doing this right, here, let me undo that. I can just turn it over to people who want to sort of ask out loud.
Okay.
Here, allow to talk, allow to talk. So y'all now are gonna have talkie rights. So if you guys wanna just start talking and showing up, that's totally fine with me.
Thank you so much for, can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Jacqueline DiBiase Salmons. Thank you so much for this talk. This was perfect. I'm teaching digital archaeology with Dr. Boudreau.
Oh,
who's
yeah.
also here somewhere. And our students are doing mock NEH digital humanities grants and presenting this week. So this was perfect timing.
Yeah, I got, you know, that whole process is really, I think because that's how it's going to be, right? I mean, that's how we're going to survive in the future. You know, we're going to really have to be on top of the whole grant writing game and keeping after the NEH. And that's kind of an interesting thing too. Kim Shelton was exceptionally kind in helping me make the transition from assistant director to director. And so I think I told Professor Ajushin this the other day. She said that when I became director, she said, "Well, congratulations, you just lost, you know, all opportunity to you just lost all opportunity to do your own research. From here on out, it's fundraising making sure everybody does their own publications. So
Yeah, I was curious to ask if you do other fundraising besides the NEH grants you've received.
So just this year, so far I've put into the Crest Foundation. We did it. I'm trying to think about who else we did. 2 NEHs so far. There was something else. Was it the Knight Foundation, if I'm not mistaken? And I think there was I know what else it was. There were a couple of sort of just letters of inquiry to the Getty.
Oh, nice.
Where you just, the foundation thing is a little bit odd, right? You do the letter of inquiry first and see what they think. So
Fingers crossed.
yeah. Just keep hammering away at it, right? So
how do you think, what type of pushback do you expect from other more older figures in the archaeological research world currently? Like, what kind of pushback do you expect from it? Also, yeah, I was trying to talk earlier, but I had technical issues, but that's okay.
So thanks, Nathan, was it?
It was, yeah.
Yeah, thanks for that. So the big pushback, and honestly, I'm not making this up. I literally gave a talk like this a couple of years ago, and a professor, after it was over, stood up and was pretty upset and told me, well, hold on a second here. It was my dig. I raised the money. I fielded the team. I kept the records. And now you want to turn around and just give it to everyone else for free? What compensation do I get? He's like, I work this hard to raise this money so that I can get archaeological credit for it. That's the equation that I follow. And he said, what are you doing it for? And I said, I guess we have different philosophies. I mean, I'm doing it to share the story of archaeology with anyone who's willing to listen. And I feel that a lot of the money that I'm getting to run the project is already coming from grants and foundations that are typically publicly funded already. And so, one of the things that I'm kind of wound up about these days is the idea of, there's an agreement that's made that we often don't pay enough attention to. When you get the right to go work in another country and to appropriate the land or purchase the land that was privately held, dig it up and study the things that come out of it, on the other side of that is you owe it to people to share with them the things you found. Now, whether that's in a finished publication or whether that's as raw archaeological data, or whether that's a public meeting that you have at the end of your season to share with the local community what you found, it doesn't really matter, but that's something we should all be doing. And so we have this kind of difference of opinion about that. One of the things that I'm really interested in with the thing that we've built is that in some ways it's kind of an experiment on the fly. There is a lot of talk that you get about, if you open up your archives to whoever and you just let people come in and do what they want, what's going to happen when the conspiracy theorists start using your archaeological evidence to prove that aliens built the pyramids? What's going to happen when so-and-so comes and poaches your work and publishes it out from underneath you? What's going to happen when, so-and-so, steals your ideas? And I say, each one of those things I think has its own answer. I think that we're smart enough as archaeologists to know the difference between the aliens built the pyramids and I believe that this hoard of coins dates to this significant event in antiquity. I think we know the difference between registers of academic work. But the other interesting thing about it is I'm not really sure if that individual's truth, as they want to believe in it, or that individual's excitement for archaeology really hurts our excitement of archaeology. If you build a digital collection, it's kind of like a never-ending, always replenishing well. Your use of my information doesn't change my use of my information. It's just two different uses of the same information. Now, I do respect the idea that if you dug it and you worked at it and you need that publication for tenure, it is not my right to give that information away for free out from underneath you. And so that's why we built into the system the ability to designate whole entire collections as private. And what we usually say in answer to that is that we've built those things into the system as a way maybe to encourage scholars to make a little bit faster progress on their publications. That basically you could enter into an agreement and say, we're putting all of this archaeological documentation up online. how much time do you think you need to publish? 6 years, 7 years? Okay, at 7 years, this stuff goes public. And in some ways that kind of creates a hard wall, a hard deadline that can kind of help move this stuff to publication.
So continuing somewhat of that train of thought, do you think that it could just be a philosophical difference from kind of an older generation who didn't really have the internet on hand compared to newer professors, newer archaeologists, newer academia as a whole? And so you think it's mostly just a philosophical difference there, because we have this giant network where information can be disseminated so easily. Why not just allow that?
So I think yeah, I think there's a little bit. I think there's one aspect of like, you know, who's born digital, who's born familiar with these tools already, right? Versus who has to go through the effort of sort of relearning the new way of doing things, and then wait for the next new way. That does get, you know, as somebody who's sort of only been in this game for like 15 years now, I get a little tired of, oh, have you heard? We're now using this software. And you're like, oh man, I just learned the old software, you know? And so I could see a little bit of that. But then again, I mean, the guy that I took a lot of my cues from was my director at the Excavations at Isthmia, and he's well into his 70s, and he espoused, you know, continues to espouse very open access policies, and was always into, like, you know, if you can put it into a database, all the better, you know. And so I think it just varies from archaeologist to archaeologist. I think it might have a lot to do with the academic and archaeological tradition in which you were raised.
Thank you.
About how many man hours did it take to get the ARC system up and running?
Oh my God, I should have kept track. I honestly don't know. Lots. Because it's an interesting thing. The project actually ended up to, obviously, as most projects do, the project took a lot longer than we thought it was going to. And what ended up happening was that the underlying digital asset management system went through a migration before we could get our system done. So the Matrix Center for Digital Humanities at Michigan State University migrated from Cora version 2 to Cora version 3. And that wasn't like a 2.1 to a 2.2. That was literally from a 2 to a 3. And so all of the ways that Cora interacted with its public-facing interfaces changed. And so we were 2 years into the project, and all of a sudden it was like, well, you can use the legacy version of the digital asset management system, but we can't promise support, you know, forever and ever. Or you can use the new version. And then it was sort of like, okay, grab all the designers, grab all the programmers, it's back to the boards, you know. And so those kind of moments slowed us down in ways that we couldn't have predicted. We got lost a lot in a lot of heavy thinking about what the system was and wasn't, what it should do, what it can't do. We got lost in a lot of heated conversations about whether we should just say, hey, look, if you're going to use our system, you are going to be open source, open access, we do not care, versus, hey, you know, there might be moments when you need to keep some things private, either for the integrity of the remains or to protect publication rights or stuff like that. We went round and round and round for months, you know, in project meetings where we weren't making any progress over sort of whatever that is, theoretical, philosophical differences. And so I think a lot of those things, you know, had we had a better sense of what we were building from the beginning, I think a lot of those things could have been streamlined. But it was clearly, it was every bit of 4 years, and then a lot of sort of volunteer time on the back end, even just to get it to fruition.
Thanks for the answer.
Yeah. I'm not sure if people, if you have questions, if you want to see kind of.
I got a question. So when you found your when you're looking through the archaeological notebooks, was there anything surprising that you found when you're reading through them, like that you didn't expect to find?
Yeah, I wish I could, you know what, I meant to keep it, but dang it, I cannot even remember which one it was. I can't even remember the date anymore. But these notebooks, they're such interesting artifacts in their own right. So one day I'm reading along because I'm trying to do some work on, I think we were reading about, I can't remember, one part of the site, I think up Northeast Gate or something like that. And we're reading about Byzantine fortification. And the archaeologists, you could tell that they're kind of new and they're recording things and they're talking about soil and things they're finding. And then for like 3 lines at the bottom of the page, it says, oh, and by the way, they declared martial law in Athens today because the regime of the colonels has fallen. And what we're talking about was the end of the fascist coup in Greece. And it's just a phenomenal moment where and then like the next sentence after that, it was like, oh, and it won't stop raining. And it was just such an odd thing that, it's sort of like archaeology, extremely important international political event, weather report. And then the next page is like, got up early this morning, we're digging in the left-hand corner of the trench. And you're like, what just happened? Like, and such amazing little moments like that. Or things like, another one was, an archaeologist in 1968 was digging and they got to Easter weekend in Greece. And Greek Easter is a big deal, right? So the last day of digging before Greek Easter, they uncovered a grave. And for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me, they opened the grave, I guess to confirm it was full. I don't really know why you would open a grave and leave it open for Greek Easter. But the next page so you can see a careful sketch of what the skeleton looked like and all that kind of stuff. And then you flip 2 pages and it's a photograph of a broken cranium. And the note underneath it is, well, apparently over Easter weekend, the party at the site got a little out of hand and now this skeleton has been smashed. And I'm like, what an interesting detail. And you go, wow. So there you go. But I think moments like that are interesting, right? Because then those become moments where you can talk to your students about why you shouldn't leave graves open over the weekend, I guess.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
That was very funny and interesting.
Are you going to like integrate the uses of like GIS and digitally, collected maps and stuff like that into this website as those things become more available?
Right. So what we're trying to do is we've built into the metadata links out to raw data sources. So what we're going to do is after we've extracted all of the spatial information for inventoried artifacts, each one of those inventoried artifacts will have its own unique URL for the system we've built for the document. And that artifact then will have an entry in a database, which is then integrated into a GIS. So eventually when we take the GIS and put it online for people to interrogate the information spatially, each one of those things, when you click identify the object, it should contain a hyperlink, right, that takes you back to the original documentation of that artifact. So we're thinking we're going to use, if you're familiar with this at all, right, the big push right now is linked open data, right? So LOD basically says, if you give every, down to the most granular level, if you give everything that exists in the digital world its own unique web identifier, you can then aggregate things and have things talk to each other regardless of what database those things are stored in. That basically the thing that ties it all together is the World Wide Web. So that potentially you could have something like, if you're familiar with what Eric Paler has built for Pompeii, I'm trying to remember what it's called. It's something like the Pompeii mapping project or something like this. He's basically built an interactive GIS of Pompeii that allows you to drill down into the individual neighborhoods and houses in Pompeii and then click on those, and it calls up a table that contains all of the publications that refer to that particular house. It's wall paintings, it's archaeological information, and even that table has hyperlinks that then take you out to raw data that is associated with that particular location. So we're looking to build something very, very similar to that. So basically ARCs will work in concert with a GIS and with an online database. So once we're done with the context material database, we're going to publish it through Eric Kansas thing, right, with Open Context over on the West Coast, which is basically just a huge archaeological raw data repository. So Open Context and Open GIS and ARCs should be able to all talk to each other. And they all have raw data export functions. So if you don't want to play the game on the web and you want to just pull down massive amounts of information and process it in like R or something like that, you should be able to have the facility to do that as well. Is that the question? Was that the question? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. So linked open data is apparently is like the, and I think we're all kind of, very, very hopeful, but sort of willing to be mildly disappointed if LOD doesn't fix all of our problems. But I think that's the idea.
Other questions? Dr. Frey, thank you so much for such a stimulating and exciting talk.
Thank you so much for giving me the time. I only wish I could have been down to kind of hang out with you guys and talk to you in person, but
Yeah, it would be, but another time, maybe we can plan this.
another time. So thank you all so much. Best of luck in your digital archaeology class and on your grant proposals. I hope they all go well. I hope you all receive whatever it is, virtual or real funding. So best of luck to you, and enjoy your week.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.